Hey everybody, Rob here. I'm going to do this review through video because I just don't really have an outlet to write about any sort of film criticism at the moment, and I really had a lot to say about what I'm going to talk about now, so I thought this would be the most direct way to get my thoughts out there on the interwebs. And what I'm going to be talking about is the recently released to Netflix film The Dirt, the biopic of one Motley Crue. Now, this is a film that generated a ton of buzz, and the reviews that I kind of saw ahead of time, I didn't watch too many of them because I wanted my review to come in fresh. It seemed to be a negative tone, but I haven't really kept up with that a lot, so I wanted to give my fresh take on it. I watched the movie last night. I kind of sat on it for a whole day thinking about some different things, and I decided to share my thoughts. Now, before I get into the film proper, I should probably give you my perspective on the band and the book of The Dirt itself. I'm a huge Motley Crue fan, have been for many years, but I'm not necessarily of the generation that would have received them firsthand. You know, I wasn't even born when some of their most famous albums had came out. I'm a child of the 90s, so my first interaction with them was a lot of the guys ending up in jail in that weird 90s period that was a very unglamorous period for the band. I caught up with the band in the early 2000s, a little bit before they had their big reunion in 2005 and had a very successful run. That's my era of the band, but I absolutely fell in love with the band. There was something that always attracted me to them, something about their lifestyle. You know, I've always been able to admit that they maybe didn't have the best songs of any other band out there. In fact, there's a lot of other bands that I probably preferred the music of, but the whole package with Motley was something that was always very attractive to me, especially as like an 18, 19-year-old kid. At a time, especially when the role of the rock star had been ceded to the hip-hop community, it was cool to read about these legendary times. And I think that's where The Dirt came in, the actual novel, The Dirt. Or should I say, the fiction/nonfiction account by all four band members and a couple of other guys surrounding the band, including John Corabi, contributed to the book. And that book was like a sacred text for me. I really enjoyed these tales of excess and even a lot of their downfall. So for me, I was big into that book. So much so that I don't have that book anymore because it kind of disintegrated on me. I had a paperback cover, but it got split in half, and I had two halves of it, and I have lost those two halves. And I haven't rebought the book. So everything I'm saying today in reference to the book comes from memory. So if I get something wrong, just keep that in mind, that I might not have it word for word. I probably haven't read the thing in 12 years, but a lot of it is stuck in my mind, and a lot of it came back to me last night watching this film. Now, I know some of this review is going to come off as quite negative towards the film, which I don't want it to be because I do want there to be balance. But that's why I figured I'll start with some of the positives I really liked from the film. Overall, it's a pretty good movie. And I know a lot of people were saying that it was going to be cheesy. Well, guess what? The 80s is kind of cheesy. Motley Crue is kind of cheesy. That's part of their appeal. If you already didn't like Motley Crue and didn't like their style and their lifestyle and what they stood for, this film's not going to do anything to change that. If you kind of embrace that and are kind of attracted to that, this film definitely has a bunch of stuff that will appeal to you. So it's kind of what you come into the film with. With that said, I think it's a very entertaining film that holds together a pretty coherent narrative that even as somebody who just knows Motley Crue from the headlines and hasn't dug deep into them will probably enjoy the film. One thing that really should be complimented on this film is how they used the soundtrack. Now, the soundtrack is basically Motley songs. I know there's been some new songs added to the official soundtrack, but during the film, it's a lot of Motley songs, a lot of Shout At the Devil era, Too Fast for Love era songs. And I just think they fit well in this film, the way they're there. Those are songs that you wouldn't see in any other movie, of course, other than the Motley Crue movie, but I thought they fit very, very well in scenes. And even there's a scene early on in the film where they're playing a version of Livewire where they don't quite have it down yet, which I think there's some definite charm to. I also want to give a shout out to Daniel Weber, the actor that plays Vince Neil. I thought of all the actors that played the four band members, he was the best and most convincing. The other three I felt like were doing a cosplay of Mick Mars, Nikki Sixx, or Tommy Lee. Whereas I felt Weber really put his own spin on Vince Neil. And there was times where I thought I was seeing Vince Neil, but I was also seeing a different version of it. And even beyond that, I think it should be noted that the film has a very powerful moment. As we all know, Vince Neil's daughter, Skylar, passed away many, many years ago. And it's really the emotional stranglehold of the movie, and something that's done very well. And Weber does a very good job in his role, and something that should be commended for this film. With so much frivolity in this film, it really hit that serious note really, really well. I want to make one thing clear. I'm not saying it omits the truth, because I think the truth is probably pretty subjective when it comes to this band. In fact, some of the more seedier parts of the book have been disputed recently by Nikki Sixx, saying he was in a bad place when he wrote The Dirt. So it's kind of hard to say what is the actual objective truth when it comes to this band and this film. What I'm going to reference here is what was in the book. And look, I'm not a guy that has to have a book fit the movie. In fact, I kind of look down on people who have that sort of criticism. I think there are different forms of art that can stand on their own. In this case, though, I think it's a little bit different because this is a biopic based on something that's supposed to be non-fiction. So you want it to be as close as possible in a film. And there wasn't a lot that was inaccurate necessarily in The Dirt. There's a lot of stuff that they missed that either would have enhanced the film or definitely needed to be in there. And I want to go through some of those. If anything, this film suffers from, well, being a film. There's only so much content that you could fit into a runtime. And if they put everything that was in The Dirt in the movie would be pretty darn long. Now, I know some people might say, yeah, you could do a mini-series a la the Unsolved series from about a year or so ago featuring Tupac and Biggie, and that might be something, but you know what, the kind of the fun and the flow of the movie might be lost in a mini-series format. So it's just something that the filmmakers had to do and decisions that had to be made by the producers. Let's run through some of the stuff that was omitted that I felt might have strengthened the story just a little bit. You know, for the most part, as is the case with the band, Nikki Sixx kind of is the main character of this film. And they do a good job of portraying his very traumatic childhood, something he's been very open about for many years. However, I think there was an element that's in the book that was missed in this film, and that would be the role of Nicky's grandparents. Nicky, by all accounts, is very close to his grandparents, specifically his grandfather as he got older, and they did take seemingly great care of Nicky if things are to be believed. So I just thought that was a weird omission to not have in there, you know, what Nicky did whenever he ran away from his mother. When he would spend time away from his mother, he was with his grandparents. Part of his nomadic existence was that his grandparents lived very nomadic, and he was along for the ride. You know, it's funny because I do think Mick Mars is the biggest unknown in the band. We know so much about Vince Neil, Tommy Lee, and Nikki Sixx, and we know so little about Mick Mars. But there's some interesting details about Mick and his personal life and his many marriages and his relationship with his children that's simply not in this film. Really, this film, you only know Mick as having his unfortunate disease and being a bit of like the sour face in the band. Mick Mars is completely underdeveloped in this film. Also, I think it would have been important to emphasize that Mick Mars, by his accounts, has never quite been comfortable being the guitarist in a big rock band. This guy was a blues player that kind of fell into Motley Crue. And there's a bit of a nod to that, but I think that's a really important aspect that needs to be explored just a little bit more. You got to give the film credit for diving deep into a lot of these guys' issues, specifically Nikki Sixx's heroin addiction. Now in the film, they frame it as his heroin addiction is a result of his troubled childhood, which I have no doubt is in fact the truth. But one thing that The Dirt mentions, and that even some of like the Behind the Music mentions, is that Nicky actually started using heroin as pain relief when he got into a car accident around the time of Shout at the Devil. Now that's a very, very minor detail and something that doesn't really fit in the story, but that's something that's very important and kind of makes the whole thing in cohesion, especially when you look at what else happened with the band as it pertained to impaired driving. So I did find it a little odd that they never mentioned Motley Crue's association with occult imagery. Like, I've never viewed Motley Crue. They're not Slayer. They're not supposed to be like this satanic type of band. But they were very big in using pentagrams and the witchcraft imagery and all that, especially with the Looks That Kill video. Now, they do have kind of a remake of the Looks That Kill video, but that's another part of their identity that was completely glossed over in this film. And it might be an unimportant thing and not really relevant to anything else, but it's a big part of how Motley Crue was seen in the public sphere back in the 1980s. With the exception of Theater of Pain and what happened with Vince Neil's DWI case before the making of that record, you really have to know Motley's discography to know what album they're talking about or where they are in the film. There's a lot of omissions. A lot of the eras just blend together. There's not really a mention of a Too Fast for Love album coming out. There's not really a mention of a Shout at the Devil coming up. Girls, Girls, Girls seems completely wiped from the film. And while they do make a sober record and it's a big hit on the Dr. Feelgood tour, it's kind of weird that Dr. Feelgood is not featured in the film. Being that's one of their biggest hits and one of the biggest hits in rock history, it's kind of out of place that it's not in there. And I think a lot of the stuff from the Girls, Girls, Girls era being merged with the Theater of Pain onto the Dr. Feelgood era is kind of weird. There was a lot of interesting stuff in the book that happened in that period, and that might have been the bottoming out for a lot of members of the band. And it's just not laid out cleanly enough, in my opinion. Speaking of the music, Bob Rock is a really important figure in rock history and in Motley Crue history, and he is completely glossed over in this film. Look, I know a lot of people have mixed opinions on what Bob Rock has done with bands, but he is definitely a successful producer and provided Motley Crue with their biggest moment of commercial success. It is really interesting that he wasn't featured at all in this movie. Now, that might be something just for music nerds like myself, but it's a very big piece of their story. While the film does focus heavily on Nikki Sixx and his personal life, you would never know that Nikki Sixx has been married 3 times in his life if you watch this film. Not only that, but any other meaningful relationships that Nikki Sixx has had, such as with Lita Ford, are completely missing from this film. Look, I know it might be a little weird and an invasion of privacy to bring that level of your personal life into the public space, but Motley Crue is trying to bear it all here. But it's a little weird that Brandy Brandt and Donna D'Errico are not featured in this film in any way, shape, or form, nor are any of Nikki's children. You know, the film goes pretty quickly through the John Corabi era, and I know that was a very quick era itself and one that's not looked at back too fondly by a lot of Motley Crue fans, but I would have liked just a little bit more on Corabi, a little more development there. I know he's not a main figure in the story, but I would have liked that to be expanded just a little bit more. In general, the biggest criticism of this film that I can levy is how little focus there is on Motley Crue during the 1990s. Motley Crue may not have been a big band in the 1990s, but they were definitely in the headlines quite a bit. And the way this kind of whitewashes over the second half of that decade is really jarring. Now, I'm going to give away some spoilers here, but I've been giving away spoilers this whole time. So if you don't want to know what's going to happen, go ahead and turn this off and go watch The Dirt. The film essentially ends with Vince Neil rejoining the band in the mid-90s after pressure from the record label to get rid of John Corabi. And while I understand why they came to the conclusion of that being the ending, that leaves off a whole lot that happened in the late 90s. One thing that it leaves off is the creative frustration that the band went through working on Generation Swine. Yeah, Vince was back in the band, but for a lot of people, it just didn't sound like Motley Crue. It was them trying to be something in music that had already passed. Mick Mars has even gone on to say that the sessions for this album really changed who he was as a guitarist and really messed with his confidence. It's kind of weird that that stuff's not in there. It's really one of the more interesting parts of the book, The Dirt. And I think the absolute biggest travesty in this film is that Pamela Anderson is nothing in this film. That makes no sense whatsoever. Look, I understand that Tommy Lee might be embarrassed about what went down with Pamela Anderson. I mean, the guy went to jail for domestic violence. That's not something I would want to talk about or necessarily have broadcast in a film. That is such an important part of their story, and even a pretty important part of The Dirt, an important part of his life, and it was an important part of pulp culture, and it's completely absent from this film. I mean, the band themselves have included things about their relationship in their songs. Look at the video for If I Die Tomorrow. They have one personal struggle that each member goes through. Vince Neil is driving a car and getting into a car accident. Nikki Sixx is dying from his drug addiction. Mick Mars receives a terminal medical sentence. And Tommy Lee is behind bars. Well, why was he behind bars? Because he hit Pamela Anderson. So it is really weird that that's not in there. Now, there is an allusion earlier in the film to Tommy Lee having issues with domestic violence, and his relationship with Heather Locklear and his marriage to her is featured in the film. So something's up with Pamela Anderson not being featured in this film. And if I could just put my Monday morning quarterback hat on just for a second, I think this film would have much more appropriately ended in 2005, when the band had got back together on this reunion tour that was in such high demand, and they went for another 10 years touring basically as a nostalgia act, even though they did release one album in that time. I thought when it ended was a bit premature of an ending, and you needed to have the Pamela stuff. You needed the late 90s stuff. Now, I understand stuff like the death of Randy Castillo, Nikki's affair with Sam Maloney. All that stuff really isn't in The Dirt, so that wouldn't be true to the book itself. But if you are going to take some creative license, I think that would have been the place to do it, and that would have been a more appropriate end. You know, overall, I've been pretty harsh on this film, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't recommend this film. If you're not a fan of Motley Crue, I think you'll get some enjoyment out of it. And if you're a diehard fan of Motley Crue, it really is a fun 2 hours. It's something you'll enjoy. You'll enjoy the soundtrack. You'll enjoy the excess. You'll enjoy all that. It's just, if I had to say one thing about this movie, it's slightly incomplete. There could have been more. And that's always going to be the challenge making these type of movies. But this one had such an egregious error towards the end that it must be pointed out. What did you think about the movie? Did you enjoy the film? Was there stuff that was left out that you would have liked to see in it? Was it just enough? Was the content of the movie coherent enough to make a good storyline and you couldn't have added anything else? Let me know in the comment section below. Later.